In Chapter 16, we will be discussing the call participles and infinitives. From grade school grammar, most of you have probably completely forgotten what a participle is and how infinitives work. And in fact, there's a certain degree of confusion that is caused because we tend to conceive participles a little bit differently in English than they are utilized in Hebrew. When we talk about a participle, it's easiest to understand the concept if you think of a participle as an ing verbal adjective. In other words, you take the verbal concept and add the ing ending. So when we take the verb walk, we end up with a participle walking. But a participle is not only a verbal form, it is also an adjective form. And as a result, when we convert into a participle, we're not only adding the ing, but we're identifying the fact that this describes a person, place, or thing. So the verb walk becomes a participle to indicate walking ones or a walking one. And it is used as an adjective then to describe some individual or some object. So a man can be a walking man, just like you would have a regular adjective and have a man be a good man or a tall man. It's a way of creating an adjective, a descriptor of a person, place, or thing using a verbal root. So these participles can be used just like regular adjectives. So if the adjective appears before the noun, we learned that it is always a predicate adjective. Tov melech, a king is good. Tov hamelech, the king is good. We also learned that if it agrees in gender, number, and definiteness, it is an attributive adjective, but if it does not agree in definiteness, it is a predicate adjective, as in the examples here. And then we learned that when both the adjective and the noun are indefinite, we have to rely upon context. Well, the same is true with using participles and their function as verbal adjectives. So participles can be used as attributive adjectives, just like we saw in chapter 6. We saw Hamelech, Hatov, the king, comma, the good one, or phrased the good king, or the king who is good would be adequate translations of that. Well, the same thing is true here. Hamelech, Ha-Holek is the king, the walking one. And we would translate this as the walking king or the king who walks. You can also use participles as predicate adjectives. So here we have an expression in which the subject, Hamelech, does not agree in definiteness with the adjective that follows. It's clearly a predicate adjective. The king, comma, a good one. The king is good. And we can do the same thing here. Hamelech, Holek, the king, a walking one. Now in this context, notice that where our basic sentence, our clause, is the king is a walking individual, a walking one. That's the function of the participle. But when we smooth it out into good English, we're not going to say the king is a walking person. We're just simply going to say the king is walking. And for us, is walking appears to be a verb rather than a verbal adjective. And this is where the confusion comes in, it's important that you understand how participles function, what their core meaning is, and differentiate that from what happens when you actually translate the participle into good English. You may find that you're actually using a verb to translate a participle, but that does not change its essential concept. And trying to differentiate how you translate, if you're focused on trying to determine whether you translate the participle as an adjective or like a noun or like a verb, it's going to be incredibly confusing. It's much better if you always think of the participle as an ing verbal adjective, in this case, a walking one, and then let the context dictate how you're going to translate that. So here we have a situation in which the predicate is clear because it goes at the front. It's the same construction we saw a moment ago. Tov Hamelech, good is the king. The king is good. Holek Hamelech, a walking one is the king, or the king is walking, the king walks. But like any adjective, you can also use a participle as a noun. It stands in place of a noun. So we could have a sentence something like this: Hatovim amaru, the good ones said. And we find that we have an adjective. It implicitly indicates men, plural, or at least a group of mixed individuals by the plural ending im, and it's standing in place of a noun. We would translate this, the good men said. The same thing can happen with a participle. Haholakim amaru, the walking ones said. And again, the plural ending is indicating multiple individuals. It indicates men, or at least a fixed group. And yet when we put it into English, it's going to be much more smooth to say those who were walking said. Start with the concept, figure out what it's trying to say, and if you understand what's being said, you'll have a fairly easy time trying to put it into the correct kind of English expression. Now, remember then that participles, because they're verbal adjectives, have no tense. You have to determine that from the context. So an expression like atem holakim, you all, holakim are walking ones. You don't know whether it's present tense. You are walking ones. You were walking ones. That kind of tense concept is communicated by context exclusively. Notice also that adjectives have no person. So when we identify a verb, we usually identify the verb stem, the call. We indicate what type of verb it is, for example, a call perfect, and then we indicate that it's a third masculine singular or whatever. Well, we still have gender and number, but you don't have person. So in this expression, anachnu holakim, we are walking ones, it is used to describe the first person plural people, but that is conveyed by the pronoun. The clause says we are, and then holakim is just a generic walking ones. It has no first person identity. That's only accomplished by means of the sentence. So when you parse participles, you can give the information of gender, number, the verb stem, and indicate it as a participle, but you should not be trying to identify person. Same thing is true with the example we had a moment ago. Atem holakim, you all are walking ones, but the word holakim has no true first person concept that it captures in its form. And with third person, anashim holachim, men are walking ones. We have, again, an example where the participle clearly has no personhood. So that's how you deal with participles. Remember, they are verbal adjectives, ing descriptors of person, places, or things. They have no tense, they have no person, and it is best to always understand them in their root idea and then translate accordingly once you understand what the context is requiring of you. The infinitives are broken into two types, the infinitive construct and the infinitive absolute. So let's begin with the infinitive construct. The infinitive construct, once again, is an ing verbal noun. So as you look here at the verb judge, we can make it into an ing verbal noun, judging. It is a concept, the concept of judging. Because it is a noun, a verbal noun, and it is in construct, you're going to find a number of things that are true about an infinitive construct. It's used in different places than a participle because a participle is an ing verbal adjective. This is an ing verbal noun, and an infinitive construct needs to be joined to something because it is a construct. So you'll see an infinitive construct joined to a noun in the example like we have here. Shafot ish, the judging of a man. So we might find it in a sentence something like, God condemns the judging of a man. Now that's actually a fairly ambiguous phrase. We don't know whether he condemns a man judging other people, so that the word ish is the implied subject of this action, or whether he condemns other people judging a man, in which case the word ish is the implied direct object. So you have to sort that out based on what's being conveyed in the context of the passage. So it can be joined to a noun. It can also be joined to a pronoun suffix. So God condemns shafot kem. He condemns your judging. Again, this expression is something that can convey either that God condemns you judging other people, or he condemns other people who are judging you, in which case the your is a possessive type pronoun, and it is the implied direct object of the verbal action of judging. You judging is the subject, others judging you is the implied direct object in this basically a construct phrase created by the suffix. Notice that in each of these cases, the infinitive construct is joined to something else. That's why it's an infinitive construct. Can also be joined to the preposition lamed to express purpose. So for example, God came down lishpot, for judging, or we would say he came down to judge. You can join it to the prepositions bait and kaf to indicate expressions of time. So we have this phrase, bishvot kem, in your judging, or when you judge, and can also be expressed as kishvot kem, according to your judging, something else happened. In your judging, the man was set free. So when you judge, or we would, in that context, if we had a sentence, in your judging, the man was set free, past tense, we would translate this when you judged, and we would use a past tense verb because the context is making this ing verbal noun set the stage for a past tense context. Let's give you a few examples from the biblical text. Vayehi kishmoa hamelech Hizkiyahu, vayikra et begadav. Now the first line, and it happened, vayehi, and it happened according to the hearing of the king Hezekiah. That's what it literally says. The infinitive construct, shemoa, is an infinitive construct because it is joined to the preposition kaf, and it's an infinitive construct joined in construct with the noun Hamelech, the hearing of the king. So it happened according to the hearing of the king, and he tore his garments. We get a vav consecutive. This is the typical Hebrew way of giving a time orientation and then continuing the narrative and telling you what happens. In English, we usually say, when King Hezekiah heard, he tore his garments, and we treat the phrase, when King Hezekiah heard, as a subordinate clause that doesn't require a connector between the first clause and the second clause. But in Hebrew, these are actually two independent actions. And if you understand the first clause as a true event, then it makes sense that you have a vav consecutive in your second clause linking the two together. We would do something like, something happened when Hezekiah heard. That's a true statement of fact. And he tore his garments. In Hebrew, these are parallel ideas. We're going to make them coordinated. So we're going to use the word that for the second vav as we link the two clauses together. And it happened when King Hezekiah heard that he tore his garments. Let's look at another example, this time in the future. Vehaya, and it will be. Remember, this is a frozen form. The vav consecutive perfect. And it will be according to the sleeping of my lord the king with his fathers. So we would say it will happen when my lord the king sleeps with his fathers. Vehayiti ani uvani Shlomo chataim, that I, namely I and my son Solomon, will be sinners. We will be offensive to the new king. And notice again that the second vav needs to be translated as that, as the transition into the new clause. So this is how the infinitive construct works. It is an ing verbal noun. You're going to use it in a place where you would use nouns. In construct, a noun goes in construct with another noun. You need an infinitive construct. You can use it with prepositions because prepositions are followed by nouns. These are the kinds of things that will occur with infinitive constructs. And once again, don't try to find the English translation until you have achieved meaning. Treat it as an ing verbal noun. Use it in the context in that way. And if you do this, you will be able to make sense of all the different contexts and usages that are utilized with the infinitive construct. We also have an infinitive absolute. Now, by absolute, we mean that it is absolutely not connected to anything. It is not linked. That makes it different from the infinitive construct. And we have to identify these two separately because they do actually have a different form and they have a different function. The infinitive absolute is likewise an ing verbal noun. So again, we take the verb judge and we make it into an infinitive absolute by adding the ing, judging. It's a verbal noun and it is not linked to anything. And what makes it different from the construct is mostly affected by the fact that it appears in different syntactical contexts than the infinitive construct. So its different function is largely driven by the different context in which it's used. As you can see from the example here from Genesis chapter 2, verse 16, In most cases, it has an adverbial use. This is the most common usage of the infinitive absolute. Basically, what it does is it underscores the verbal idea by repeating it in an infinitive form. So here we read, from any tree of the garden, akol tokel, eating you may eat, or eating you will eat. This could mean from any tree of the garden you may only eat, you may surely eat, you may continually eat. Any of those meanings are possible. We know that it's not only, because hypothetically Adam and Eve could have gone outside the garden and had some fruit from outside the garden too. It would not have been prohibited by God. It's underscoring the fact that they are truly permitted to eat from anywhere except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So we would use the form something like, you may surely eat, you may freely eat. And in most cases, the infinitive absolute is used in this fashion with the infinitive absolute and the verb sharing the same root. But on occasion, you will also find that the infinitive absolute can appear in a different root. So for example, here we have Isaac became great, and he continued to increase until he became very great. Now the phrase, and he continued to increase, is vayelek halok vegadol. So he went, going, and growing. So the idea, Isaac became great, and he went going and growing until he became very great. And as you try to decipher what the author's trying to say, it appears that what he's trying to convey is that he was constantly increasing in his greatness as he grew to become a great man. So we would capture these two infinitives in a sense of saying something about continuity, that he continued to increase. He went to greatness in a growing process. So Isaac became great and continued to increase until he became very great. Here we have another example. And they said, the man questioned us carefully about ourselves and our relatives. Now, you actually had this in your last lesson. It doesn't have this form in it because we had to modify the Joseph story because you hadn't had this verb form yet. But in the biblical text, it says that the man Sha'ol, the man indeed questioned us. He continuously questioned us, carefully questioned us. Notice again that the translation that's been chosen here is one that most accurately reflects the English equivalent for the Hebrew idiom. The idea is that the brothers are trying to explain how it is that they gave up the information that they had a brother, and their father, being upset, should be forgiven them because they had no idea that the questioning was going to go to this extent, and that it was only because the leader of Egypt, Joseph in disguise, had drawn it out of them. So that's the most common use of the infinitive absolute as an adverb. Just think of it as an ing verbal noun that underscores in some way the action that is taking place and either stresses it or modifies it, which is exactly what the function of an adverb is. On occasion, the infinitive absolute can also be used as a substitute for a regular verb. So for example, in the Ten Commandments, you have all these statements: you will not do this, you will honor your father and mother, And then when we get to Exodus 20, verse 8, we have Zakor et HaShabbat. Remember the Sabbath. Now, it's not truly an imperative. It is an infinitive, and for some reason in Hebrew, the infinitive can substitute for any verb form, and the reader just knows in context what needs to be provided, and you translate accordingly. The infinitive absolute can also stand in place of a noun as a verbal abstract idea. So here, for example, in Proverbs, we read, showing partiality, and I've tried to capture it with the ing form to try and retain the concept of what the infinitive absolute is. Showing partiality in judgment is not good. Now notice, this is not an infinitive construct. In judgment is a prepositional phrase. So those are not, they're not linked. The word showing partiality has to stand by itself. It's not connected to anything in the sentence. And so an infinitive absolute is needed because it stands on its own. Here we have in Job chapter 9, verse 18, Job complains about God, that God does not allow me catching my breath. He does not permit me the concept of or the action of catching my breath. And this is really the direct object of the verb. We have an ing verbal noun functioning in place of a noun in the sentence. So here's another example. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17. Learn doing good. And I've hyphenated it to, again, stress the fact that this is actually a single word. It's an infinitive absolute. This is, again, the direct object of the verb. This is what you are to know. And it captures a verbal abstract. So the infinitive absolute is most often used in an adverbial sense. It can substitute for a regular verb, and occasionally it stands in place of a noun. And probably 95% of the time, if you understand the infinitive absolute as an ing verbal noun and conceptualize it that way in your head, you will again be able to understand in the context what the author is trying to say and provide a good English translation. That is how the participles, infinitive construct, and infinitive absolute work. Now we need to talk about what they look like. So the forms of the participle for the call include actually two types. We have an active participle that we'll begin with. Remember that these do not indicate person, first person, second person, third person, and so you'll notice that in the box on the left, we have them only indicated as masculine singular, feminine singular, masculine plural, and feminine plural. The basic thing that you're looking for in the call is the long O vowel in the first syllable, co-tail. This is your basic form of the call participle. And since a call participle, or any participle, is an ing verbal adjective, it means it's going to take noun endings. So we can fill in the rest of the paradigm quite easily. So the feminine would be ko-ta-la. Alternatively, you will sometimes see this form, kotelet, which has kind of a seglet noun pattern at the end. It has the tav that is characteristic of the old feminine ending, and those two forms appear interchangeably, so you should memorize them together. So kotel, kotala, or kotelet, and then, as we would expect, kotalim and kotalot. These are the forms of the active participle. But as you learned in the chapter on call perfects, we also have call statives. There are verbs that have a stative meaning. They describe not an action, but a state of being in which one finds himself or herself. So here we have the verbs shakav, to be lying down, gadal, to be great, kaved, to be heavy, and katon, to be small. Now notice that there's a dashed box around the items here on the right with the I and U class stative verbs. In these participles, the forms of the participle will be identical to the form of the stative perfect. So kaved has the same participle, kaved. The verb katon, to be small, has the same participle. And then they will reduce just like you would expect an adjective to reduce, just like the nouns that we saw. So kaved, kaveda, kavedim, kavedot. Or katon, ketona, distant open syllable reduces, ketonim, ketonot. Now notice the difference. The verbs on the left, the active verbs, reduce like verbs. It's the near open syllables that reduce. The stative verbs reduce like regular nouns and adjectives. The near open syllables lengthen and remain long. So there's a difference in the way that they form these, but they function exactly the same. Now you'll notice that the statives also have A-class verbs, shakav and gadal. These are kind of in a mixed world. They look exactly like the active verb, and so as a result, some stative participles will be formed exactly like the active. So shakav actually has a participle shokav, shokava, shokavim, shokavot. But gadal, on the other hand, follows the pattern for the statives. So you'll find gadal, but the participle will be gadel, gedelah, gedelim, gedelot. So these are kind of a mixed pattern. There is also something in the call called an internal passive. So you'll eventually be learning that there are entire paradigms that are devoted to the passive idea. So for example, kick, be kicked. Kick is when you're doing the action and it's directing the action outward. Be kicked is when you're receiving the action and it's coming toward you. There are entire verb paradigms that convey that different nuance of the direction of action. But for some reason, the call actually has a passive participle embedded in the active paradigm, in the call paradigm. And the passive participles are characterized by the long U-class vowel that shows up in the second syllable of the form. So whereas kotail would be killing, katul would be being killed. And these will, again, reduce just like we would expect. The second syllable has a pure long vowel that can't change, so we end up with a very standard and expected katul, ketulah, ketulim, ketulot. Now that's a lot of information, but we want you to focus in on this. Memorize the active call paradigm, okay? The active participle, kotail, kotalah, kotelet, kotalim, kotelot. Memorize the passive participle, katul, ketulah, ketulim, ketulot. And pay attention to the fact that a participle can be identical to the stative perfect. So memorize kaved and katon. Now, if you understand vowel reductions and you understand how the words are formed in each of these paradigms to the left, you'll notice that in the active, the near open syllable is reducing just like you would expect in a verb. So kotail, kotala, kotalim, kotalot is just the expected pattern of vowel reductions. So you might be able to get away with cotail, kotala, and kotelet, just so that you remember the form of the word, cotail, and you remember the fact that there are two alternate feminine singular forms. The rest of them are formed the way you would expect, and you'll be able to recognize them in context. Same with the passive participle, katul. It's logical that all the rest of the forms are ketula, ketulim, ketulot, because distant open syllables reduce. So I can actually summarize the information on the left-hand side of the page with just a handful of forms, and I can memorize kaved and katon as the stative participles. That brings the call verb paradigm to conclusion, and you can see here from the slide in front of you all the forms that you have learned thus far. It's important that you master these and become very familiar with all of them. And as you do, pay special attention to the fact that you have to note the vowel patterns as you're learning these words and learning to distinguish them. The 6 examples here are spelled exactly the same in terms of the consonants. It's the vowels that make the difference between the various forms. The imperative and the infinitive construct highlighted in red are identical in form, with a schwa under the first consonant and a long O under the second consonant. And it is context that's going to help you differentiate these. The imperative being used when you're issuing a command directly to an individual, the infinitive construct in the context that are appropriate for an ing verbal noun. The ones in blue are likewise distinguished only by vowels. Katal is a perfect. The active participle is kotail. Passive participle is katul. And the infinitive absolute is katol. So there's a lot of similarity, and I have to make sure I'm paying attention to these vowels. In the examples here, we see that we have a comet's hay ending that makes all of these forms slightly similar. Once again, the 2 forms in red have an identical appearance. This time, however, although they appear identical in print, they are not pronounced the same. The difference is the first vowel. The perfect, third feminine singular, is going to be ka-tala. The meteg, the little vertical line there, helps us remember that the first syllable is supposed to be pronounced as an open syllable, and as an open syllable it will have to have a long vowel and is pronounced ka-tala. The imperative, on the other hand, is not feminine at all. It's just a long ending, and the first vowel is an O sound, kot-la. As you're reading, you can learn to anticipate when you find yourself in a situation where the context demands an imperative and you run across this type of form. Be sure to pronounce it kotla. When you're dealing with a past tense context describing the actions of a woman, you would pronounce it as a perfect, katala. And then my participles, again, have the same type of ending, but the vowel patterns are different, and I have to recognize the characteristic long O in the first syllable of the active participle, kotala, and the long U in the second syllable that's characteristic of the passive participle, ketula. Before we finish, let me call your attention to one other thing that will at least explain some of the differences that you'll see in the pronunciation of certain forms. The call infinitive construct and the call imperative have a historic pattern that goes back to 2 short U-class vowels, kutul. Let me illustrate for you what happens with a call infinitive construct in its various settings so that you can understand what happens when you encounter it in the text and it seems to have completely different vowels. When the infinitive construct appears all by itself, it's pronounced katol. It does so because it is acting in a manner consistent with the vowel rules that you learned before. We learned that closed unaccented syllables take short vowels. There are no short vowels in this particular form, or short syllables rather. We learned that near open syllables lengthen in nouns, but in verbs they reduce. And we learned that distant open syllables reduce. Now, of those rules, the ones that apply here are the near open syllable. It reduces, so the original short U reduces to schwa, and the second short U lengthens under the influence of the accent. And this is the form that you normally see with the infinitive construct. However, when a suffix is attached, you may find it in this form, ketol kem. Now, in this particular form, because of the addition of the suffix, the word is longer, and the historic short U that is at the front of this word now finds itself in a distant open syllable. The second syllable is a closed unaccented syllable, and you know from your vowel rules that closed unaccented syllables take short vowels. It's still pronounced katol, but because of the syllable structure, it requires a short vowel instead of the long vowel that you saw at the left. So we have katol when it's by itself, and ketol kem when it appears with this particular suffix. But in some cases, we find that the suffix that is attached is going to create an entirely different scenario. So here we have the suffix him or his. So this is the killing of him. And in this context, again, because of the vowel rules, the near open syllable in a verb will reduce. That means that this time, the vowel under the tet reduces to schwa, and then the short U at the beginning of the word cannot reduce as well in a distant open syllable because it would create too many consonants in a row without vocalization. So the short U vowel is retained, and then because short U is only used before doubled consonants, or at least predominantly used there, they use the short O. So with a suffix, this particular suffix, the infinitive construct is going to be pronounced coat low. Now notice the difference between these forms. In one, we have a schwa followed by a long O. In the next, we have a schwa followed by a short O. And now we have a short O followed by a schwa. And the same is true in this next example when we add the plural suffix them, their killing. The vowels can change, but the underlying historic structure remains constant, and the only reason the vowels change is because of the varying conditions of the syllables and the accent and how that affects the vocalization of the word. So every one of these words is exactly the same. We know what the historic structure is because the short U vowel in the first syllable is the only one that can explain the presence of a schwa or a short O. We know that there is a short U historically under the second syllable because that is the only vowel that can explain the presence of a long O, a short O, or a schwa. And you know from your vowels chart, the vowel changes, that these are the variations that can exist of a historic short U class vowel. So this is just another way of introducing you to the concepts that are going to be developed throughout the grammar and that will constantly augment and enhance your understanding of the Hebrew text. But here it's used to show you that even though the form may change, these are still infinitive constructs. You should still be able to recognize them by their usage. And what will help is if you memorize kutul When you encounter something that seems odd, it doesn't sound like it's pronounced the same, ask yourself the question, is it an infinitive construct, and is it consistent with kutul and the vowel changes that I have learned? And in each case, this will verify whether or not your assessment of the word as an infinitive construct is accurate or not.